The great silver bird, an Airbus A330, cut a smooth and silent path through the endless blue dome of the sky, its twin engines a low, humming testament to human ingenuity. 37,000 feet below, the ocean stretched out in a vast, shimmering carpet of deep blue and turquoise, its surface wrinkled by currents unseen from this serene altitude. Inside the aircraft, the atmosphere was one of manufactured calm, a carefully curated environment of recycled air and gentle, artificial lighting designed to lull its 273 souls into a state of placid transit. This was Flight 418, a non-stop journey from London to Singapore, a 12-hour capsule of time suspended between destinations, a metal tube carrying its cross-section of humanity across the world. In the cockpit, Captain Mark Reynolds, a man with 25 years of sky behind him and the calm, weathered face to prove it, performed his duties with an effortless precision that bordered on boredom, his hands resting lightly on the controls, his eyes flicking between the array of screens that told him everything he needed to know about their perfect, uneventful progress. His co-pilot, a younger man named Evans, sipped from a plastic cup of water, the mundane action underlining the profound normalcy of the moment. Back in the main cabin, the gentle roar of the engines was a constant, soothing white noise, a sound so pervasive it had already faded into the subconsciousness of most passengers. The flight attendants, gliding up and down the aisles with practiced smiles and quiet efficiency, were the ballet dancers of this high-altitude theater, their movements smooth and unobtrusive. One of them, a young woman named Sarah with a kind face and tired eyes, patiently listened to a passenger in 12B, a man in his 40s named David, whose expensive suit and air of impatient entitlement suggested a life spent giving orders and expecting immediate results. He was pointing dismissively at the small plastic cup on his tray table, his voice a low, insistent grumble about the quality of the whiskey, his dissatisfaction a tiny, contained storm in the otherwise tranquil cabin. Sarah nodded, her smile never wavering, her response inaudible over the engine's hum but clearly placating, a professional diffusing of a minor irritation. And in seat 34A by the window, sat a woman who seemed to be the very embodiment of the flight's quiet anonymity. Anna Petrov was a woman in her early 50s, with a gentle, unassuming face framed by strands of gray-streaked brown hair that she had tucked neatly behind her ears. She was reading a thick, well-worn paperback book, its title obscured by her hand, and her entire demeanor suggested a person who was deeply accustomed to and comfortable with being overlooked. She did not fidget, she did not seek conversation with her seatmates, she simply existed within her own peaceful sphere, her eyes moving slowly across the lines of text, occasionally pausing to look out at the breathtaking expanse of nothingness and everythingness that filled her window. She was a portrait of stillness, a neutral figure in the vibrant tapestry of the cabin, which included families with sleeping children, students with headphones on, couples holding hands and solo travelers like herself, all lost in their own worlds, all trusting the fundamental promise of commercial flight, that they would be delivered safely. This collective trust, this fragile bubble of routine, was shattered in an instant. The event was not preceded by a drop in cabin pressure or a lurch of turbulence. It began with a sound. A sharp, percussive crack that was utterly alien to the plane's natural acoustics. It was the sound of the cockpit door being violently forced open from the outside, a sound of shearing metal and splintering plastic that cut through the engine's drone like a knife. For a single heart-stopping second, there was a silence of pure, uncomprehending shock. And then the screaming started. 3 men erupted from the area near the front galley, their faces contorted masks of fear and wild determination, brandishing weapons that looked crude and terrifyingly effective. They were not military, their movements were frantic, uncoordinated, fueled by a desperate adrenaline that made them even more dangerous. They shouted in a language many passengers did not understand, their voices hoarse and cracking with strain, just wildly with their guns for everyone to stay down. The lead hijacker, a young man with fever-bright eyes and a thin, nervous frame that seemed too small for the violence he was projecting, charged down the center aisle. This was Ivan. He shoved a flight attendant out of his way, his head on a swivel, taking in the entire scene of panicking humanity with a frantic energy. He screamed a command in heavily accented English, "Silence! Heads down! Down!" His companions, equally young and terrified, moved to cover the exits, their weapons sweeping across the rows of seats, causing people to flinch and cry out as the cold reality of their situation crashed down upon them. The previously composed cabin was now a swamp of raw, primal fear. Children wailed, held tightly by sobbing parents. A man prayed loudly, his words tumbling over one another. The previously assertive David in 12B was now utterly transformed, his face ashen, his body pressed deep into his seat as if trying to disappear into the leather, all his bluster evaporated, replaced by a petrified, wide-eyed terror. Through the open cockpit door, the stunned face of Captain Mark Reynolds was visible for a moment, filled with a professional's rage and a human's fear, before one of the hijackers shoved him back into his seat, barking orders about changing course. Reynolds's mind, trained for emergencies but never for this specific violation, raced, scanning for options, for weaknesses, for any sliver of hope. His eyes, sharp and assessing, scanned the cabin behind the hijacker now standing over him. He saw the panic, the paralysis. He saw the strong men frozen. And his gaze fell for just a moment on the woman in 34A. Anna Petrov had closed her book and placed it neatly on her lap. She was not cowering. She was not sobbing. She was sitting upright, her hands resting calmly on the closed cover of her novel, and she was watching the lead hijacker, Ivan, with an expression of deep, unsettling concentration. There was no fear on her face, only a focused, analytical calm. Reynolds dismissed the sight instantly. His mind categorized her as being in shock, or perhaps simple, unable to process the danger. In a situation that demanded action, her passivity marked her as useless. He turned his attention back to the armed man in his cockpit, writing off the calm woman as just another terrified passenger, another soul he had to somehow save, a burden and not an asset. He could not have been more wrong. The initial, explosive wave of panic began to recede, not because the danger had lessened, but because the human mind and body can only sustain such a peak of terror for so long before a dreadful, exhausted numbness sets in. The cacophony of screams and cries dwindled into a pervasive, haunting soundscape of muffled sobs, ragged breathing, and the low, constant whimper of a child somewhere near the back of the cabin, a sound that seemed to etch the hopelessness of their situation into the very air. The hijackers, having established their violent dominance, now patrolled the aisles with a tense, jittery vigilance, their eyes darting from face to terrified face, their weapons held tight, fingers resting nervously near triggers. The lead hijacker, Ivan, had positioned himself near the front, his back to the closed cockpit door, his gaze sweeping over his hostages. His earlier frantic energy had condensed into a sharp, paranoid alertness. He was like a coiled spring, and everyone sensed that the slightest wrong move, the smallest unexpected sound, could be the catalyst that made him unspool into violence once more. Captain Mark Reynolds, seated rigidly in his cockpit chair, was a prisoner in his own command module. The man behind him, one of Ivan's accomplices, smelled of sweat and nervous energy, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Reynolds's training screamed at him to act, to find a way to regain control, but the cold presence of the gun barrel pressed against the back of his head was a brutally effective argument against any sudden heroics. His mind, however, was racing, calculating, assessing. He had managed to send a truncated distress signal, a mere blip of data, before the comms were torn from his control, but he had no way of knowing if it had been received. His eyes were constantly moving, flicking from his instruments, which showed the plane turning onto a new, ominous heading dictated by Ivan, to the reflection in the windshield that showed a sliver of the cabin behind him. He was looking for anything, a tool, a weapon, a distraction. Most of all, he was looking at the people, searching for a pair of eyes that showed not just fear, but understanding, a spark of resolve, a potential ally in this nightmare. His gaze, sharp and desperate, scanned the rows. He saw the big, athletic-looking man in a football jersey, now curled into a fetal position, his face buried in his hands. He saw the group of young backpackers who had been so boisterous during boarding, now silent and pale, their adventurous spirits utterly broken. He saw the arrogant businessman David from 12B, who had seemed so full of bluster and self-importance, now visibly trembling, a dark stain of fear spreading across the expensive fabric of his trousers. Each face told a story of utter helplessness. And then once again his eyes found her. The woman from 34A. Anna Petrov. She was in the same position as before, back straight, hands in her lap. But she wasn't looking out the window at the vast, uncaring sky anymore. Her entire attention was fixed on Ivan. She was studying him with an intensity that was completely alien to their environment. She wasn't just looking at him, she was reading him. Her eyes tracked the nervous tap of his foot against the carpeted floor. She noted the way his free hand, the one not holding the weapon, would occasionally clench and unclench, the knuckles white. She observed the slight tremor in his shoulders, the rapid, almost imperceptible movement of his Adam's apple as he swallowed repeatedly. To Captain Reynolds, a man of action and direct solutions, This woman's behavior was inexplicable and, in a way, infuriating. In a crisis that demanded movement, her absolute stillness seemed like a deficit. Her calmness, he wrongly assumed, was not courage but a failure of comprehension. He constructed a narrative in his mind. She was simple, perhaps slow, maybe sedated. She didn't grasp the mortal peril they were all in. Her quiet observation looked like vacant staring. She was another variable in the equation of survival, a neutral one at best, a potential liability at worst. If Ivan were to turn and see her staring, it might set him off. She was a problem to be managed, not a resource to be utilized. Reynolds let out a quiet, frustrated sigh, a mere exhale of air, and deliberately turned his mental attention away from her. He focused instead on the man with the gun to his head, on the controls, on the fuel gauges, on anything that seemed like a tangible element of this disaster. He dismissed Anna Petrov completely, categorizing her as part of the helpless mass he was responsible for, a weight on the scale he had to balance. He could not see that her stillness was not an absence of action, but a different kind of action entirely. He was looking for a soldier and had therefore blinded himself to the presence of a strategist. His perception, narrowed by stress and his own preconceptions, failed to recognize the profound power being cultivated in the quiet woman in seat 34A, a power built not on force, but on profound and patient observation. Time, inside the pressurized cabin of Flight 418, had lost all connection to the world below. It no longer flowed in minutes and hours but in heartbeats and frightened glances, measured by the slow, agonizing pace of Ivan's patrol up and down the center aisle. The air grew thick and stale, heavy with the smell of fierce sweat and the acrid tang of unbrushed teeth and stale breath, a palpable fog of human misery. The initial shock had worn off, sanded down into a raw, grating anxiety that wore on every nerve. The hijackers, too, were feeling the strain of the long wait. Their movements became more irritable, their commands more snapped and less coherent. The man guarding the rear exit yawned widely, his eyes glazed with exhaustion, before jerking back to alertness with a guilty start. Ivan himself was unraveling. The nervous energy that had initially powered him was burning out, leaving behind a brittle, volatile shell. His eyes, which had been bright with fanatical purpose, were now shadowed and darting, haunted by the reality of the situation he had created. He would pause and lean heavily against a seat back, his shoulders slumping for a second before he remembered his role and snapped upright, his weapon waving erratically. It was during one of these moments of visible exhaustion that Ivan's frustration found a target. An elderly man in 24C, overcome by a coughing fit he could no longer suppress, choked and sputtered into the tense silence. The sound was jagged and loud, a disruption in the oppressive quiet. Ivan spun around, his face contorted with sudden, irrational rage. He saw not a sick old man but a challenge, a disobedience. He stomped down the aisle, shoving past other passengers who flinched away from his touch. He reached the old man and grabbed a fistful of his shirt, hauling him half out of his seat. "Silence!" Ivan screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "I said silence. You make noise again, I give you something to choke on." He shook the terrified man like a rag doll. The act was one of pure performative cruelty, a desperate attempt to reassert a control he was palpably losing, to frighten others because he himself was so deeply frightened. A fresh wave of terror washed through the cabin. This was it. This was the moment the abstract threat became horrifyingly real. Captain Reynolds, watching the scene unfold in the reflection of his instruments, felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He braced for a shot, for an act of violence that would shatter the fragile standoff and plunge them all into a deeper darkness. His hand, resting on his knee, clenched into a fist of utter impotence. And then, something extraordinary happened. From the window seat in row 34, a figure moved. Anna Petrov did not stand up quickly. She did not shout. Her movement was slow, deliberate, and eerily calm. She placed her book neatly on the empty seat beside her and then, with a quiet grace, she rose to her feet. Every eye in the cabin, including Ivan's wild, furious ones, snapped toward her. The silence became absolute, broken only by the old man's ragged breathing. Ivan released his grip on the man, letting him slump back into his seat, and turned his full, menacing attention to the woman who dared to move. He took 2 steps toward her, raising his weapon, pointing it directly at her chest. His finger was tense on the trigger. He began to yell, a torrent of angry words in his native tongue, his voice cracking with strain. The passengers around Anna recoiled, pressing themselves against the windows and the aisles, wanting to be anywhere but near the inevitable violence that was about to erupt. Captain Reynolds watched, his heart hammering against his ribs, his mind screaming that this foolish, simple woman had just signed her own death warrant and possibly theirs. But Anna Petrov did not flinch. She did not cower. She held up one hand, palm out, not in a gesture of surrender but in a gesture of pause, of request. And then she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear and steady, cutting through Ivan's tirade with an almost physical force. She did not speak English. She spoke in Ivan's own language, her accent flawless, her tone not one of confrontation, but of profound and unexpected recognition. "Your hand is shaking," she said, her words meant for him alone, though the entire plane heard the unfamiliar melodic sounds. "You have been standing for so long. Your shoulder must ache from the weight. This is not the work you were meant for." Ivan froze. The anger on his face did not disappear, but it was joined by something else. Utter, complete shock. His mouth, which had been opened to shout more threats, remained agape. The gun in his hand, which had been rock-steady in its aim, now wavered. He was being spoken to but not as a monster or a captor. He was being seen as a person. And the person seeing him was the last person he or anyone else on that plane would have ever expected. The world inside the cabin of Flight 418 seemed to have stopped spinning on its axis. The very laws of physics, or at least the laws of human conflict, had been suspended. The gun was still there, a cold, black eye staring at Anna Petrov's heart, but its menace had been fundamentally altered not by force but by words. Ivan stood frozen, his body a statue of confusion, his mind visibly reeling as it tried to process the impossible reality that this unassuming woman in a window seat was addressing him with perfect, colloquial fluency in the language of his childhood, a language he had assumed was a secret shield in this foreign environment. His eyes, wide with a mixture of suspicion and a desperate, bewildered curiosity, scanned her face, looking for a trick, for a trap, finding only that same unnerving calm. Anna did not wait for his permission to continue. She understood that the spell of shock was fragile and needed to be woven into something stronger. She kept her hands visible and relaxed at her sides, her posture non-threatening, her voice maintaining that same low, steady, almost melodic rhythm. She continued in his language, her words a soft counterpoint to the harsh, panicked commands he had been shouting moments before. "You did not sleep last night," she observed, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact, a shared understanding of exhaustion. "Your eyes are red with it. To carry such a weight without rest, it is a heavy thing." She took a very slight, almost imperceptible step forward, not an advance, but a movement that created a more intimate space between them, excluding the 200 other hostages. "The man you shouted at, he is sick. He is old. His fear is already a prison. You do not need to build its walls higher." She was reframing his act of cruelty into one of unnecessary effort, implying he was wasting his energy, appealing to a latent pragmatism beneath the fanaticism. From his prison in the cockpit, Captain Mark Reynolds watched this silent play unfold, his professional mind struggling to categorize what he was witnessing. He could not understand the words, but he could read the body language with the clarity of a textbook diagram. He saw the tension slowly leaching from Ivan's shoulders. He saw the deadly focus of the gun's aim soften, the barrel dipping a few degrees until it was pointing at the floor between them. He saw the hijacker's head cock slightly to the side, like a confused animal hearing a familiar but unexpected sound. Reynolds's earlier assessment of Anna Petrov shattered into 1,000 pieces. This was not shock. This was not simplicity. This was a level of composure and audacious strategy so profound it felt alien. A hot wave of shame washed over him as he remembered his dismissive thoughts. He had been looking for a weapon, for a hero to charge the gunman, and he had completely missed the diplomat, the quiet general who was now dismantling their enemies without throwing a single punch. His eyes flicked to the flight attendant, Sarah, who was watching Anna with a look of awe, tears of hope mingling with her fear. Anna continued, her voice a gentle, relentless tide eroding Ivan's resolve. "They told you this would be a moment of power," she said, and now her tone held a faint, sorrowful empathy, as if she pitied him for the lie he had been sold. "But this," she made a small gesture that took in the stinking, terrified cabin, the exhausted hijackers, his own trembling hand, "this is just weariness. This is just waiting. There is no glory in frightening the sick and the tired." She was isolating him, subtly separating him from the ideology that had brought him here and refocusing him on the immediate, grinding misery of the moment. She was making him see the reality of his situation, not through the eyes of a captor, but through the eyes of a fellow human being trapped in a dreadful, unsustainable predicament. Ivan's lips moved but no sound came out. He was trying to form a response to reassert his authority, but the script he had been given had no lines for this. He was utterly disarmed, not by a SWAT team, but by a single calm voice speaking the truth of his own exhaustion back to him in the comforting cadence of home. The balance of power on Flight 418 had irrevocably shifted, and it had happened in complete silence for everyone but two people. The strange, intimate bubble that had formed between Anna and Ivan in the forward section of the cabin created a pocket of suspended animation, a temporary truce built on shared language and psychological exhaustion. For the other passengers, the terror remained, but its edge was blunted by a dawning, bewildered hope. They did not understand the words, but they could not misinterpret the body language. The gun was down. The shouting had stopped. The hijacker's attention was entirely consumed by the quiet woman. This unexpected lull, this fragile calm engineered by Anna's intervention, was not wasted. It created a precious commodity they had been starved of, an opportunity. Captain Reynolds, his mind now violently recalibrated to see Anna not as a liability but as their greatest asset, knew this was their only chance. He could not communicate with her directly, but he could communicate around her. His eyes, sharp and focused, locked onto flight attendant Sarah, who was kneeling in the galley, her body trembling. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, then let his gaze drift deliberately down to the small hidden panel near her knee that housed the aircraft's internal phone system. It was a redundant, hardwired line, separate from the main compromised communication array. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. Sarah's eyes widened in understanding, then darted toward Ivan, who was still engrossed in his quiet conversation with Anna. The risk was astronomical. If he turned and saw her, it would all be over. But the opportunity was too critical to ignore. Moving with a slowness that made each second feel like an hour, Sarah shifted her body, using the galley cart as a partial shield. Her fingers, shaking uncontrollably, found the edge of the panel and pried it open with a silence that was a testament to her professional training. Inside the cockpit, Reynolds held his breath. He could see the reflection of Sarah's movements in the windshield, a distorted, ghostly ballet of life and death stakes. He kept his own body perfectly still, not wanting to draw the attention of his own captor, whose focus was also partially divided by the strange scene unfolding in the cabin. Reynolds's co-pilot, Evans, understood the play and began to engage the hijacker in the cockpit in a low, mumbled conversation about their heading, a pathetic attempt at a distraction that nevertheless added one more layer of cover. Back in the galley, Sarah's fingers found the cold plastic of the handset. She did not pick it up. Instead, she carefully, painstakingly, pressed the direct line button that would connect her to the ground operations center of the airline's main hub. She then slid the handset off its cradle just enough to break the connection light, letting it rest silently on the base. If anyone glanced over, it would appear normal. But the line was now open. A tiny sliver of their reality, the muffled sobs, the engine's hum, the tense, quiet murmur of Anna's voice, was now bleeding out into the world, being recorded by a horrified operator thousands of miles away. This was not a dramatic broadcast of their coordinates or a shouted plea for help. It was a whisper of data, a ghost of their situation. But it was enough. It was a thread, however thin, connecting their hijacked bubble to the vast, powerful machinery of law enforcement and negotiation on the ground. The authorities would now know the hijackers' numbers, could hear the state of the hostages, could perhaps even pick up enough of Anna's translated words to understand the dynamics at play. They would know the plane was not a scene of active massacre but a tense, volatile stalemate. This intelligence was priceless. It would allow them to plan, to position, to wait for the exact right moment. All of this was made possible because Anna Petrov, the woman in 34A, had done the impossible. She had not fought force with force. She had created a space for patience. She had traded a moment of violent confrontation for a sliver of time, and in a situation like this, time was the one thing more valuable than any weapon. She had given them a chance, and in the galley and in the cockpit, two professionals had been ready to take it. The plane continued to fly toward its unknown destination, but it was no longer a sealed tomb. It was now a listening device, and its quiet, steady heartbeat was being heard. The altered course set by Ivan's demands had taken Flight 418 far from its intended path, away from the bustling international corridors and into a vast, empty stretch of airspace over a remote and desolate region. The view from the windows, which had once been a mesmerizing expanse of blue ocean, had gradually shifted to a harsh, sun-baked landscape of browns and grays, a parched earth scarred by canyons and dotted with stunted vegetation, a place that seemed utterly removed from the world of people and help. This sense of isolation was a psychological weapon in itself, deepening the passengers' despair. On the navigation screens in the cockpit, a small, unassuming airstrip appeared, their designated landing point, a tiny scratch on the face of the wilderness. Ivan, peering over Captain Reynolds's shoulder, pointed at it aggressively, his earlier moment of connection with Anna fraying under the pressure of the impending landing. There. You put it down there. Smooth. No tricks. His voice was regaining its shrill, panicked edge. Captain Reynolds, his face a mask of professional compliance, nodded. Setting up for our descent, he said, his voice neutral. But his heart was hammering. This was the moment. The entire flight, the hours of terror, had been funneling toward this point. As he began the complex procedures for landing, his eyes were constantly flicking to his instruments, not just for navigation but for confirmation. And there it was. A tiny, prearranged code blinking on a secondary screen, a signal from the transponder that was invisible to the hijackers. It was the confirmation he had been praying for. The open phone line from the galley had worked. The authorities were not just aware, they were waiting. The remote airstrip was not a sanctuary for the hijackers. It was a meticulously laid trap. Every movement he made now was a performance, a pantomime of cooperation designed to lull Ivan and his accomplices into a false sense of imminent victory. He could feel the plane begin to lose altitude, the engines throttling back, the familiar pressure change building in everyone's ears. In the cabin, the descent broke the strange spell Anna had woven. Ivan pulled away from her, retreating back into his role as captor, though the certainty he had initially projected was now gone, replaced by a jittery anticipation. He barked orders at the other hijackers to prepare for landing, to keep the passengers in their seats. The atmosphere became electric again, charged with a new kind of tension. The endgame was here, but no one knew what that end would be. Anna slowly sat back down, her work done. She had given them the time, had softened the hard edge of their captor's resolve just enough. She had created the conditions for this moment. Now it was in the hands of others. The plane continued its steady, seemingly routine descent, lining up with the single dusty runway below that looked abandoned but, to a trained eye like Reynolds's, showed signs of very recent, very discreet activity. Tire marks on the dust, a slight shimmer of heat haze that didn't quite match the surroundings. The wheels of the Airbus groaned as they lowered and locked into place, a deep, mechanical sound that vibrated through the entire frame of the aircraft. They were committed now. Ivan stared out the cockpit window, his face a mixture of triumph and naked anxiety, completely unaware that he was flying them directly into a net. The runway rushed up to meet them. The tires screeched as they made contact with the tarmac, a jarring, beautiful sound of return to Earth. Reynolds expertly reversed thrust, the engines roaring in protest as he slowed the massive machine. They were down. They were on the ground. For a moment, there was a surreal silence inside the cabin, broken only by the whine of the engines spinning down. Ivan let out a shaky breath, a smile starting to form on his lips. It was in that exact second of his guard dropping, that precise moment of perceived victory, that the world outside exploded into motion. From behind rusted hangars and out of shallow ditches, a swarm of black-clad figures emerged, moving with a coordinated, terrifying speed. Vehicles with flashing lights converged from all sides, sealing off every inch of the runway. The door of the aircraft was still closed, but they were surrounded. The hijackers, stunned, rushed to the windows, their weapons forgotten for a crucial second as they looked out at the impossible army that had materialized from the empty desert. The door to the cockpit burst open and the hijacker guarding Reynolds was wrestled to the ground in a blur of efficient violence. The main cabin door was being accessed from the outside. The siege was over almost before it had begun, ended not by a violent assault on the plane, but by a perfect, patient and utterly overwhelming ambush on the ground. The passengers sat in stunned silence, trying to process the sudden, deafening absence of the threat that had consumed them for hours. They were safe. The cacophony of the rescue was a beautiful, overwhelming symphony of shouted commands, the heavy thud of boots on the aircraft steps, and the grateful, hysterical sobs of 273 people realizing, all at once, that their nightmare was truly over. The doors were wrenched open, flooding the stale, fear-filled cabin with fresh, hot desert air and the blinding light of the late afternoon sun. Figures in black tactical gear, their faces obscured by helmets and visors, moved through the plane with a calm, methodical precision that was the absolute opposite of the hijackers' frantic chaos. They swiftly and efficiently secured Ivan and his accomplices, who offered no resistance, their spirit and their supposed cause utterly broken long before the commandos had ever breached the door. The passengers were guided, dazed and weeping, out onto the hot tarmac where a triage area had been set up, with medics offering water, blankets, and quiet words of comfort. In the midst of this controlled chaos, the social order of the cabin began to reassert itself, but in a profoundly altered way. The man who had been so loud and important, David, stood shakily on the asphalt, wrapped in a foil blanket that shimmered in the sun. He watched the quiet woman, Anna Petrov, as she was helped down the steps by a paramedic. She declined a blanket, simply nodding her thanks, her demeanor still that same island of calm in a sea of released emotion. David's face, pale and streaked with tears, crumpled not into more crying, but into a look of profound and painful shame. He remembered his own preening arrogance, his complaints about the whiskey, his internal sense of superiority. He remembered, with a stabbing clarity, his sheer, pants-wetting terror and his utter uselessness when the crisis came. And he remembered the woman he had dismissed as nobody, the one who had, through sheer will and compassion, held their fragile world together. He shuffled toward her, his steps unsteady, his eyes fixed on the ground. When he finally looked up, his voice was a broken, raspy thing. I thought. "I'm so sorry," he stammered, the words utterly inadequate for the weight of his feeling. "I didn't, thank you. Thank you." Anna offered him a small, gentle smile, a look that held no judgment, only a quiet acknowledgement of his words. "We're all safe now. That is what matters," she said, her voice soft, absolving him of the need to say more. Near the nose of the great aircraft, Captain Mark Reynolds stood with a group of officials, giving a preliminary report. He had performed his final duty, shutting down the engines and systems, securing his wounded bird. But his mind was not on the procedures. His eyes searched the crowd until they found her. Excusing himself, he walked toward Anna Petrov. The distance between them felt immense, a gulf spanned not by meters of tarmac, but by the vast difference between his initial judgment and her ultimate action. He stopped before her, and for a moment the seasoned captain, the authority figure, was simply a humbled man. He stood straight, looked her directly in the eye, and his voice, though tired, was clear and filled with a raw, unvarnished respect. "Madam," he began, the formal address feeling entirely appropriate. "My name is Mark Reynolds. I am the captain of this plane, and before another second passes, I must apologize to you." He swallowed hard, the memory of his dismissal of her burning in his mind. "When this began, I assessed everyone. I looked for strength. And when I saw you, I made a terrible, foolish mistake. I thought your calm was ignorance. I thought your quietness was weakness. I judged you based on nothing but my own narrow expectations, and I was wrong. You were the strongest person on this aircraft. Your courage, your wisdom, you saved every life on this flight today, including mine. I am in your debt, and I am so very sorry." Anna listened to his entire speech, her head slightly tilted. She saw the genuine anguish in his eyes, the weight of his professional and personal failure to see what was right in front of him. She reached out and placed a hand gently on his arm. "Captain Reynolds," she said, her tone warm but firm. "You were doing your job. You were looking for a fight. I was looking for a conversation. We both, in our own ways, were trying to bring everyone home. There is no need for a debt. I am just grateful you are a skilled pilot who got us to the ground." Her humility, her immediate deflection of praise, and her reframing of his actions as a different kind of service, was the final lesson, the deepest cut of all. It was a grace he knew he would spend a long time trying to deserve. The story of Flight 418, of the quiet woman who disarmed terrorists with words, would soon spread around the world, becoming a legend. But for those who lived it, the lesson was personal and permanent. It was a lesson about the danger of first impressions, about the invisible strength that resides in calm intelligence, and about the transformative power of a humble apology. It reminds us that the loudest person in the room is rarely the most powerful, and that true courage often wears the face of quiet resolve. We live in a world that constantly shouts, that values bluster over substance, that encourages snap judgments. The story of Anna Petrov is a vital antidote to that. It urges us to look deeper, to listen more closely, and to never underestimate the profound impact of compassion and calm. It is a story worth remembering, a lesson worth sharing. If you found value in this tale of quiet strength overcoming loud violence, if it made you think about the hidden depths in those around you, then consider subscribing for more stories that explore the profound and often unexpected ways that courage can manifest. There are countless narratives waiting to be told that challenge our assumptions and remind us of the better angels of our nature. Your subscription helps ensure these important lessons continue to be shared.